Welcome to the lecture on multiples. Multiples are a very simple way to value an asset or a company. Now, they're simple, but they're not very precise. So it's best to combine them with a more rigorous valuation method. If you think about our DCF valuation, when we talk about valuing financing effects using APV or WACC, right, those are very careful methods for valuing projects. Multiples aren't very careful, but they're very simple. And so it's nice to kind of see both types of valuation techniques. It's going to be a pretty short lecture because they're so simple. We can go through it pretty quickly. There's not a whole lot to discuss. We'll define what a multiple is. We'll do some examples, and then we'll provide a motivation, a theoretical motivation for the enterprise value over EBIT multiple. All multiples are essentially a ratio. So we pull up the whiteboard here just so you have it. The ratio has two components. The numerator is going to be a market value, and the denominator is going to be an accounting value. And the idea here is that this ratio should be similar for similar companies. There's a variety of multiples out there, right? So you can use any market value you can think of, any accounting value, put them together, and you got yourself a multiple. Some of the more commonly used multiples are the enterprise value over EBIT, right? The enterprise value is the market value of all of the operations of the company. The EBIT obviously is an accounting number. It's the operating income. Or you could do enterprise value over EBITDA. We've also seen the PE ratio when we covered stock valuation, right? This is the share price divided by the earnings per share, right? That's multiple. You're just taking a market value, share price, dividing it by the earnings per share. Again, that's an accounting number, and that's a multiple. But you can do this for anything. So you can do sales as well, price over sales, enterprise value over sales. You can look at market value over book value, etc. We use this to help us get kind of a quick and dirty valuation. So the idea is consider the following example. Suppose you know information about Coca-Cola. You know the EBIT, let's do price per earnings ratio. So suppose you know the earnings per share and the stock price for Coca-Cola. We want to use this to figure out what the price should be for Pepsi, say. You're an analyst, you're trying to figure out what should Pepsi's stock price be. One thing you're going to do is you're going to compare it to Coca-Cola because it's a pretty similar company. We're going to set up the multiple. It's going to be market value divided by an accounting ratio. So we're going to do this for Coca-Cola. So what's the market value for Coke? It's going to be the price, the share price for Coca-Cola. And the accounting value that we have is going to be the earnings per share for Coca-Cola. With a multiple, this ratio should look the same for Pepsi. So what is the price of Pepsi? We divide that by the earnings per share for Pepsi. And the ratio should be the same. That's kind of the intuitive idea. If we know the price of Coca-Cola, and we know the earnings per share for Coca-Cola, and we know the earnings per share for Pepsi, then we can infer the price for Pepsi. We're just going to solve this. If we want to know what Pepsi's stock price should be, we're just going to do one step of algebra to solve. It's going to be the earnings per share for Pepsi multiplied by the multiple, where the multiple is the PE ratio. That's one way you could figure out the price of Pepsi. There's some pros and cons here. Right away, you see how easy it is. Right? So it's very simple to do this. That's a pro, and you don't need any finance to do this, right? You don't need any technical knowledge to roughly value a company like this. It's also useful to provide a benchmark for, say, an IPO. With an IPO, you've got a private company where you don't have a lot of data on it, and it's going to go public. And you want to know, what should the price be for this company for which I don't have much data? You can look at other IPOs. So for example, if you want to figure out what should be the price for Snapchat when Snapchat goes through an IPO, well, you look at Twitter. Twitter went through an IPO a little bit earlier. See, these are kind of similar, social media companies. If I can look at the IPO price for Twitter relative to, say, its user base when it went through an IPO, I can compare that to Snapchat's user base when it goes through an IPO, and then kind of figure out what should be the implied price for Snapchat. So it's a useful benchmark when you don't have a lot of data. You can look at what other companies have seen in the past, and then infer what the company you're interested in should be priced at. I think the main benefit of multiples are in these last 2 points. So let me talk about this final bullet first. With a multiple, you're using a price, right? You're using a market value. Here, if I want to find the price of Pepsi, I'm using the price of Coca-Cola. That's useful because the market has information that you probably don't have. Right? If you're trying to value Pepsi, one way to do it is to forecast all of Pepsi's cash flows, get a good discount rate for them, figure out the WACC, discount the cash flows by the WACC to get the value of Pepsi, and then figure out what that means for its share price. Okay, so you can do it very rigorously, very carefully, but you have to make a lot of assumptions along the way. If you look at the price of Coca-Cola, on the other hand, there's a bunch of other market participants, a lot of other people doing research on Coca-Cola and figuring out what the price should be. You're implicitly using all of that information when you use the Coca-Cola multiple. Right? All that information that the market has used, all that kind of consensus that shows up in the price of Coca-Cola, that can be used when you do the multiple analysis. Right? You're implicitly using that market consensus. So if your forecast is missing some stuff, you can kind of check it. You can see if your DCF method for Pepsi aligns with the market consensus for Coca-Cola. Right? And if it doesn't, then that means you're probably missing something along the way. That relates to point 3 as well. When we do a DCF valuation, right, you forecast all the cash flows that you can, but then at some point you have a terminal value. At some point you can't forecast into infinity. You forecast for 5 years or 10 years, and then you need to have some value at the end to capture everything after your forecast. What we've done in the past is we've used a growing perpetuity to capture that terminal value. An alternative is to use a multiple, use an exit multiple, they call that, to get a rough measure of the value of the company after your forecast. And likewise, that's beneficial because it's capturing this market information that's hard to model and carefully account for. Some disadvantages is it's almost too easy to use. Right? Again, you don't need any finance kind of knowledge to do a calculation like this. You just look, you see, well, I know what Pepsi's earnings per share is, I know what Coke's earnings per share is, and I know what Coke's price is, so therefore the price of Pepsi should be blah. It's almost too easy to do it, and so people are going to use it inappropriately. People aren't going to understand exactly what's going on underneath the hood for these types of calculations. And so that's one risk. We want to dig a little bit more deeper today to see what's going on underneath the hood before we kind of go forward. Another disadvantage is that it's static. When we did this PE ratio for Pepsi, what is the earnings per share? You're going to capture the earnings per share at one moment in time for both Pepsi and for Coca-Cola. So that's a little too static. We shouldn't be very comfortable with that. We know that earnings per share can change a lot over time. If you're using this multiple, you're just confining yourself to using the earnings per share at one moment. And so we should be uncomfortable with that. Likewise, we're using accounting information, right? No matter what multiple we use, we're putting an accounting value in the denominator. Even if it's something like, earnings per share, we know that there's a divergence between accounting numbers and market values. When we studied free cash flows, for example, we went through this whole business of translating cash flows to the accounting information. We went back and forth between accounting data and cash flows, right? Because we know that there's this wedge. And so if you're going to use an accounting number in the denominator, you know right away that there's going to be some wedge between that and the cash flows that we actually care about. And so that's going to create a kind of a messiness in the valuation. It can be hard to get close comparables. Pepsi and Coke, okay, those are pretty close, right? That's maybe that's the first example I came up with. That's probably a good comparable. Again, if we were thinking about Twitter's IPO versus Snapchat's IPO, it's not exactly clear how close those are, right? They're social media, so they're somewhat similar, but the business models are going to be different audiences, et cetera. And so it's not exactly clear how comparable you can get to a company like Snapchat. And finally, you can worry about multiples promoting, hurting, and trend chasing. So what do I mean by this? Well, suppose you're studying Pepsi and you want to figure out what the price of Pepsi should be. So you go through this exercise. Well, it should be equal to the multiple for Coke. Well, now suppose you're a analyst studying Coca-Cola. Well, you're going to do the same exact thing. You're going to say, well, the price of Coca-Cola is going to be the earnings per share of Coca-Cola times the Pepsi multiple. And so if you're both looking at what each other are doing, then you're not really valuing the company at all. You're just kind of mimicking each other. And so that can create hurting and then trend chasing. You're just doing whatever the other guy's doing, and no one's actually getting at the fundamentals of the business. That would be one problem with multiple valuation. Okay, so that's very generally the idea. What is a multiple? What are the pros and cons of it? There's lots of multiples out there, right? You can come up with any multiple you want, just dividing a market value by an accounting number. We're going to spend a fair amount of time on the enterprise value over EBIT. We like this because it has some theoretical basis. Okay, we can tie this to the fundamentals of the company. I'll foreshadow it a little bit, but when we use this multiple, EV over EBIT, we're implicitly treating the company as if the free cash flows are a growing perpetuity. Remember that the enterprise value is the discounted value of all the free cash flows. The EBIT is the first piece in the free cash flow equation. And so we'll work through the mechanics a little bit in more detail, but that's what we should know for now, that there is a fundamental kind of justification for that multiple. Everything here is tied to the operations, right? EBIT is the operating income. That also means that it's not going to be driven by pure financial effects. If we think about the price per earnings ratio, for example, well, we know that earnings are after interest expense. So if you have a lot of debts, you're going to have lower earnings. Right? So now the PE ratio is being driven partially by how much debt you have, which isn't very satisfying, right? We want to get at the kind of the operations of the company. We want to compare companies with similar operations. And so EV over EBIT is one way to do that. A little note here on trailing versus forward multiples. With a trailing multiple, you're using an accounting number from the past. So you're using like the most recent earnings per share, for example. A forward multiple is using a forecasted accounting number. So analysts figure out what the forecasted earnings per share will be next year. And so the forward multiple would use that projected earnings per share. The trailing multiple would use the most recent earnings per share. Generally speaking, it's better to use the forward multiples if you have them. Those forecasts contain more information than the historical values, right? Analysts have to sit down and think about what's going to happen in the future. So they're accounting for what happened in the past and then building on that to make a forecast for the future. And so generally it's better to have those forward multiples if you have the data. We said that we can create any multiple we want. We just need a market value and an accounting value. So what happens if a company is losing money? So Twitter goes public when they're still losing money. Well, you can't use the PE ratio, because if the earnings per share is negative, then you're going to have a negative price for Twitter, which doesn't make sense. Likewise, you can't use the EV over EBIT multiple, because if the EBIT is negative, then that's going to imply that the enterprise value is negative. Again, that doesn't make sense. So the answer is a little bit ad hoc. You just pick a different accounting number. You pick an accounting number that's not negative. So you pick something like sales. So Twitter didn't have a very successful IPO, but so Twitter share price went down a lot after their IPO. They had a pretty successful IPO if you judge it by its valuation, but things didn't turn out very well afterwards. So if you look at the price per sales ratio, Twitter had the third highest price per share ratio, kind of as of the time of writing here, but that didn't translate into long-term performance, unfortunately. Okay. All right, so let's just take all of this information we had, make sure we can do some calculations. We're going to value this company using two different multiples. We're trying to value a firm that has the following accounting information: the EBIT of $1 million and a net income of $600,000. We also have balance sheet information. We know how much cash they have: $1 million in cash, $3 million in debt, and then 150,000 shares outstanding. We're going to estimate the stock price based on an EV over EBIT multiple and a PE multiple. For EV over EBIT, we see that comparable companies have an EV over EBIT of 11. So that's going to be our multiple. And then comparable companies have a PE ratio of 16. So we're going to use that multiple. We're going to get different answers when we use different multiples, but I want to make sure that we can go through the steps here. All right. So comparable companies have this multiple. So we need to figure out the enterprise value over EBIT for our company, and then translate that into the stock price. We have a market value in the numerator and the accounting number in the denominator. Now, we look at our company and we see the EBIT. We see the EBIT is $1 million. So if you have $1 million in EBIT, then that tells you what the enterprise value should be. The enterprise value over $1 million should be 11. That implies that the enterprise value is going to be 11 million. So that's it. That's the multiple. That's the only new part for today. To review some of this old stuff that we've covered, we have to estimate the stock price based on the enterprise value. All right, so just to recall, the enterprise value is going to be equity plus debt minus your excess cash. So for this company, we know that the enterprise value is 11 million. We don't know the equity. We're going to solve for that. We know that the debt is 3 million, and we know that the cash is 1 million. That's going to allow us to solve for equity. Equity is going to be 11 plus 1 minus 3, so that's going to be 9 million. Finally, we solve for the share price. We know that the share price is going to be the value of all the equity divided by the number of shares. So all of the equity is 9 million, and we know that we have 150 100,000 shares, that's going to give us an implied share price of $60. So that would be one way to value this company. Again, this was the new stuff for today, just calculating the enterprise value using the multiple we have. And then we know all this business about the enterprise value from kind of before the first midterm. Let's do the same exact thing using a PE multiple instead of an enterprise value over EBIT multiple. Call it the PE multiple is the price over earnings per share. So let me just indicate that. That's the share price divided by the earnings per share. That's 16. What is the earnings per share for this company? The earnings per share is going to be your net income divided by the number of shares. So you get earnings divided by shares. That's it. We have $600,000 in income, and we know that we have 150,000 shares. So the earnings per share is going to be $4 per share. We know that the price over earnings ratio is 16. So that gives us the following. We know that P over 4 is 16. That's going to allow us to solve for the price as 16 times 4, which is 64. And that's it for today, right? That's the new stuff. You have this market price over accounting number. Do one step of algebra to solve for the price that you care about. Notice that we have two different answers here. If we use the PE ratio, we get $64 per share. If we use the EV over EBIT multiple, we get $60 per share. That's common, right? It's not a very precise method. So you use different multiples, you're going to get different answers. That's just the nature of the method. Next, I want to spend a little bit of time working through the enterprise value over EBIT multiple. We want to tie it somehow to fundamentals. And so with EV over EBIT, we can do that. With the other multiples, it's going to be harder to do, but at least with EV over EBIT, we can do that, and we can think about why the multiples may be different for fundamental reasons. As I alluded to before, when we use the enterprise value over EBIT multiple, we're actually treating the free cash flows as if they're a growing perpetuity. Okay, so let me copy that down here. So you should know this. That's what's going on underneath the hood. I'm going to work through some derivation here. You don't need to know the derivation, but you should know this first line. And then you should know the punchline of the derivation, which I'll get to in just a minute. So when we have this enterprise value over EBIT, taking the enterprise value as a discounted value of all the free cash flows, so that's familiar. And the free cash flows are going to be a growing perpetuity, so here's our growing perpetuity formula. I'm going to flesh this out a bit more. Recall what is a free cash flow? It's going to be the EBIT times 1 minus T plus depreciation minus CapEx and minus any increase in net working capital. Again, this is a bit more kind of work than you need, but I wanted to show the steps here. Ultimately, what I want to do is I want to pull out this EBIT, right? I want to have this multiple, EV over EBIT. So I have EV on the left, I have EBIT over here, but I want to pull it out so I can put it in the denominator for the enterprise value. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to say the enterprise value is equal to the free cash flow over R minus G, but I'm going to pull out this EBIT term. Okay, so it's a little bit long, but all I did was I took this EBIT times 1 minus T, and I divided everything in this numerator by EBIT times 1 minus T. Okay, so EBIT times 1 minus T, if I divide it by EBIT times 1 minus T, I get 1. So I pull out EBIT times 1 minus T, so there's that 1 there. And then I divided everything else here by EBIT times 1 minus T. Okay. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to replace this kind of ugly looking fraction here, depreciation minus capex minus increase in net working capital. I'm going to replace that by what I call the investment ratio. The idea here is that capex and net working capital, those are investments into the company. And likewise, depreciation is part of that investment. When you make capex, depreciation goes up when you make more capex. So you can work through the accounting here, and I worked through it in the slides here, but we call this the net investment. This is how much new investment that the company is making. If I divide it by your NOPLAT, right, EBIT times 1 minus T, that's our profit after taxes, then I'm left with an investment rate. How much of your profit are you putting into the company? And this should be a minus, excuse me. Actually, this would be this is the minus the investment rate, because capex is negative here, right? So these are negative investments, so this would be a negative investment rate. So really the investment rate, if I multiply everything by a -1, the investment rate is going to be this. Plus. That's going to let me simplify my EV equation. Okay, let me just make a note here. The investment rates is IR. That's how much of your earnings you're investing back into the company. That allows us to simplify quite a bit. We get the enterprise value is equal to EBIT times 1 minus T times 1 minus the investment rate. Right? So I'm just simplifying this very kind of ugly thing. I'm just calling this thing the investment rate, and then divide by R minus G. Okay. So the final step is to actually get that EV over EBIT multiple. Divide both sides by the EBIT, so I get 1 minus T times 1 minus the investment rate all over R minus G. All right. And that's it. That's the theoretical basis for the EV over EBIT multiple. We started up here. We said the free cash flows are a growing perpetuity. We ended up deriving it. the conclusion of that statement, we get a EV over EBIT multiple. And this is also going to help us pin down the fundamentals. What drives this multiple? In particular, if your discount rate goes up, for example, then your multiple is going to go down. We get the opposite with G. Your multiple goes down if G goes up. Right? G is the growth rate in your free cash flows. So if that goes up, your multiple is going to if that goes down, then the multiple is going to go up. Right? If R goes up, then the denominator gets bigger. That means your multiple is going down. If G goes up, that means your denominator is going closer to 0. That means your multiple is going up. What else is driving the multiple? Well, the tax rate's there. So when would the multiple go down? If your tax rate goes up. Right? If your tax rate goes up, then this thing becomes smaller. That means your multiple is smaller. And then we have the last driver here, this investment rate. If you're putting more of your money back into the company, your investment rate goes up. That means that you're going to have a lower multiple, right? If this thing goes up, then this whole term goes down. That means your multiple goes down. So what is IRR in this context? This is how much investment you need to make in order to sustain G. Okay, so obviously G is a good thing. G is the growth in your free cash flows. So if you have a higher G, you've got a higher multiple. But how do you get that G? You need to invest in the business. If it requires a lot of investment to maintain that G, then your multiple is going to go down. So G is good, but you need to put money in, and the more money you need to put in to get the growth, the lower your multiple is going to be. This gives us the basically 4 ingredients for our EV multiple, so we can think through the fundamentals of the business. If we want to use this multiple to compare companies, they should be similar along these lines. Okay, that's the punchline. If I wanted to value Pepsi using the EV over EBIT multiple for Coke, you need the discount rate to be similar for Pepsi and Coke. You also need the growth rate and the free cash flows to be similar for Pepsi and Coke. You also want the tax rate to be similar. You also want the investment rate to be similar. If these things are different, then that's going to create a difference in the multiple, in which case learning about Pepsi using Coke's data is going to be a little dicey because the fundamentals are different. That's all worked out here in the slides. Again, don't worry about the derivation. What you should know is that we have this top line here. We're implicitly treating the free cash flows as a growing perpetuity. Okay, so we're simplifying the firm quite a lot already. And then you should know the punchline, that if we want to use this multiple to compare different companies, they should be similar along these dimensions. Okay. And that's all laid out here. The EV over EBIT multiple moves along these lines that we've spelled out. Practically, which companies do you use as comparables? Well, so ideally, the comparable companies would share these characteristics, but kind of practically, what do people do? You can look for companies in the same industry and of roughly the same size. Okay, it's hard to find comparables, but those are the two dimensions that are probably the most important: industry and size. If you get those two down, then probably these fundamental variables are going to be similar. The last topic on multiples is exit multiples. The idea here is with terminal values. Okay, so when we did a DCF valuation in the past, recall what the terminal value was. We had something like this. If we have a terminal value at time 10, how did we calculate that? Right, we're forecasting all of our free cash flows, but we can't forecast cash flows forever. So we forecast 10 years worth of free cash flows, and then we use a terminal value to pick up everything after time 10. Okay, so recall. So we've done this before. We need to get this terminal value. How have we done this in the past? Well, we said the terminal value is going to be a growing perpetuity. So we'll take, say, the free cash flows at time 10. We'll multiply that by the terminal growth rate and divide it by R minus G. The other way to calculate a terminal value is to use a exit multiple. You calculate the terminal value using some multiple valuation, and that just gives you the total value of the company there, rather than messing around with this growing perpetuity. Right? The main problem here was that G drives the valuation. Small differences in G can have big effects on your terminal value, which can have big effects on your total value for the company. An alternative approach to calculate the terminal value is to use a multiple. This way we have kind of a second opinion. Right? We don't have to put all of our eggs in this basket where we have to pick a G, and maybe we pick right, maybe we pick wrong. With a multiple, we're able to get some extra information to see if what we're doing is reasonable. If the terminal value we get using the growing perpetuity setup is very different than the terminal value we get using a multiple, then we should be worried, right? Then we may want to revisit some of our assumptions. This is all summarized in the slides here. The terminal value is picking up the enterprise value at the end of the forecast. We've used the growing perpetuity in the past, but we know that has this flaw where we need to take a stand on the terminal growth rate, and that terminal growth rate is very, very important to the valuation. It has a big difference all the way back to time 0. So an alternative is to use the EV over EBIT multiple. If we know what the EBIT is going to be at time 10, then we can figure out what the enterprise value is going to be at time 10 using a multiple. We could use other multiples, but I think the EV over EBIT is the safest bet here. So in conclusion, this exit multiple can be a reality check on the terminal value. reality check to a growing perpetuity guess like that. So let's do an example to see how this would work in practice. You're trying to value Coca-Cola, and we've got very simple free cash flows. $100 next year, $110 in 2 years, $125 in 3 years. Further, you know some accounting information. You forecasted the EBIT to be $90 in year 3. That's all for Coca-Cola. Now, you look at Pepsi, that's a comparable company, and you see that they have an EV over EBIT multiple of 5. We're going to use that to figure out what the enterprise value should be for Coca-Cola using a WACC of 12. Okay, so let's draw out the cash flows. We've got time. We'll have a EBIT here. We know that the EBIT is going to be $90 in year 3. We don't know what it's going to be before that. We're not going to use it before that, but we know it's going to be 90 at time 3. We know that the free cash flows are going to be 100 in a year, 110 in 2 years, and 125 in 3 years. We're going to need to get a terminal value. To calculate the enterprise value, we have to discount all these free cash flows, but we only have the free cash flows for year 3, up to year 3. So we need to have some other number to capture the terminal value, to capture the value of everything after time 3. How can we get the enterprise value at time 3? Well, we can use this multiple. The enterprise value at time 3 divided by EBIT at time 3. Using Pepsi, we get that that thing should be 5. Pepsi's comparable. So the multiple should be 5. We know Coca-Cola's EBIT at time 3 is going to be 90. Right, that's given here. So let me add a subscript here just to be clear that we're looking at Coca-Cola now. We can use the multiple to figure out what the enterprise value for Coke should be at time 3. It's going to be the EBIT at time 3 times the multiple of 5. So the EBIT is 90. We multiply that by 5 to get 450. That's going to be our terminal value. And recall that the terminal value is an enterprise value. It's the value of all the free cash flows after the forecast. So the terminal value we're going to use then is the 450. It's going to be 5 times 90, which is equal to 450. That's the only new part for today. We just have this new trick to calculate a terminal value using a market data from Pepsi. Going forward, we're just going to value this company like we did all the way back with our DCF slides. We're going to discount all the free cash flows. We're going to discount the terminal value by our discount rate of 12%. What is the enterprise value for Coca-Cola today? We're going to discount all the free cash flow. So we got a free cash flow at time 1, discount that by 1 plus the WACC. Free cash flow at time 2, discount that by 1 plus the WACC squared. And then a free cash flow at time 3. And then finally, we have the terminal value. That's also sitting at time 3. $100 discounted at 12%, plus $110 discounted at 12%, 125, and then finally 450. So you put all that into your calculator, and you can figure out that the enterprise value for Coke should be about 586. At the very beginning, we talked about the pros and cons of using a multiple. Those same pros and cons are going to apply here, right? We've got 2 options when we calculate an enterprise value. We could use a growing perpetuity, or we could use a multiple. So let's lay out the pros and cons of this perpetuity method that we're used to. It's a little bit nice that we can tie it to fundamentals. Right? You can think through, what do your sales have to look like in order to get this level of growing perpetuity. And so you can do that. It's somewhat tied to the fundamentals here. The problem is this growth rate is very important, right? Your entire valuation for the company is going to be very sensitive to that G, and it's not clear that you're picking up everything. It's not clear that you know enough to figure out what that G should be. With the multiple method, you're using market consensus again. You're using that information for Pepsi, right? All the investors for Pepsi figure out that the ratio should be 5 for the enterprise value over EBIT. That's useful. You're going to implicitly use all of that wisdom when you use your multiple. Hopefully that's capturing missing ingredients from your model, right? You don't have everything in your head, so you can discipline your valuation a bit by using a multiple in addition to this DCF. But obviously the multiples are going to suffer from all of the cons we talked about before. Right? We're basing it on an accounting number. It's static. It's accounting, so it's not a cash flow. These are all downsides. It's also going to be hard to get close comparables for a lot of companies. Pepsi and Coke are one thing, but for most companies, it's going to be hard to get a comparable that are that close. To conclude, multiples are used all over the place, so we have to understand them. They're very convenient. You don't need to know very much. You don't need to be very careful to use them. It's a very simple way to relate the fundamentals to a market value. The downside, it's not very rigorous, however, so it's best to use DCF valuation in conjunction with a multiple, right? You want to use both to make sure that you're not missing anything. We like to use EV over EBIT because we can understand the fundamentals a bit more. Right? We can walk through this and see what exactly is driving this multiple. And then we can use that to discipline which comparables do we choose. Which companies should we compare with? We should be comparing along these dimensions. And finally, we introduce something called exit multiples. This is an alternative way to get a terminal value. And it's a good way to kind of check your work a bit. Do it a couple different ways. Make sure that your answers are reasonable and kind of fall in line with what the market values are showing. If you use the market values in the comparables, hopefully that lines up with what you would be getting in your more standard DCF valuation.